they found themselves standing on the very edge of the wild wood. In front, a great space of quiet fields, hemmed by lines of hedges black on the snow, and, far ahead, a glint of the familiar old river, while the wintry sun hung red and low on the horizon. Pausing there for a moment and looking back, they saw the whole mass of the wild wood, dense, menacing, compact, grimly set in vast, white surroundings. They turned and made swiftly for home, for firelight and the familiar things it played on. As he hurried along, eagerly anticipating the moment when he would be at home again among the things he knew and liked, the mole saw clearly that he was an animal of tilled field and hedgerow, linked to the ploughed furrow, the frequented pasture, the lane of evening lingerings, and the cultivated garden plot. "It looks as if we're coming to a village," said the mole. The rapid nightfall of mid-December had beset the little village as they approached it on soft feet over the powdery snow. Little was visible, but squares of dusky orange-red on either side of the street, where the firelight of each cottage overflowed through the casements into the dark world without. The inhabitants were gathered round the tea table, absorbed in making apple cider and quilting cozy blankets for cold winter nights. It was from one little window, with its blind drawn, that the sense of home and the little curtained world within walls most pulsated. Once beyond the village, where the cottages ceased, they could smell the friendly fields again, and they braced themselves for the long last stretch, the stretch that we know is bound to end in the rattle of the door latch, the sudden firelight, and the sight of familiar things greeting us as long-absent travelers. They plodded along steadily and silently, each of them thinking his own thoughts. Ratty, as was his habit, had his eyes fixed on the straight gray road in front of him, so he didn't notice poor Mole when suddenly the summons reached him and took him like an electric shock. We others, who have long lost the more subtle of the physical senses, have not the proper terms to express an animal's intercommunication with his surroundings. It was one of these mysterious fairy calls from out of the void that suddenly reached the mole in the darkness, making him tingle through and through with its very familiar appeal. He stopped in his tracks, his nose searching hither. Home! That was what they meant, those soft touches wafting through the air, the invisible little hands pulling and tugging. Why, it must be quite close. His old home, the home that he had so hurriedly forsaken and never sought again, that day when he first found the river. And now it was sending out its scouts and messengers to capture him and bring him in. The call was clear, the summons was plain. He must obey it instantly and go. "Ratty!" he called. "Hold on!" "Oh, come along, Mole, do," replied Ratty cheerfully, still plodding along. At that moment, the otter decided to leave his fellows, and waved a hand of farewell to the mole, and gave his good friend the water rat a warm and hearty handshake, and he was off. "Please stop, Ratty," pleaded the poor mole, in anguish of heart. "You don't understand. It's my home, my old home. I've just come across the smell of it, and it's close by here." Ratty was by this time very far ahead, too far to hear clearly what the mole was calling. Mole, we mustn't stop now, really, he called back. It's late, and the snow's coming on again, and I'm not sure of the way. And I want your nose, Mole, so come on quick, there's a good fellow. And the water rat pressed forward on his way without waiting for an answer. Poor Mole stood alone in the road, his heart torn asunder, and a big sob gathering. He subsided forlornly on a tree stump and tried to control himself, for he felt it was surely coming. Ratty, astonished and dismayed at Mole's grief, quietly and sympathetically asked, "What is it, old fellow? Whatever can be the matter, tell me your trouble, and let me see what I can do." The poor Mole found it difficult to get any words out between the upheavals on his chest that followed one upon another so quickly and held back speech and choked it as it came. I know it's a shabby and dingy little place, but it was my own little home, and I was fond of it. And I went away and forgot all about it, and then I smelt it suddenly, on the road, when I called and you wouldn't listen, and everything came back to me with a rush, and I wanted it. Oh dear, oh dear. And when you wouldn't turn back, Ratty, and I had to leave it, though I was smelling it all the time, I thought my heart would break. We might just have gone and had one look at it, Ratty. Only one look. It was close by, but you wouldn't turn back, Ratty. Oh dear. Recollection brought fresh waves of sorrow, and sobs again took full charge of him, preventing further speech. Ratty stared straight in front of him, saying nothing, only patting the Mole gently on the shoulder. After a time he muttered gloomily, "I see it all now. What a pig I have been. A pig, that's me. Just a plain pig." He waited until Mole's sobs became gradually less stormy and more rhythmical. He waited until at last sniffs were frequent and sobs only intermittent. "Well now, we'd really best be getting on, old chap," and set off up the road again, over the toilsome way they had come. "Where are you going, Ratty?" cried the tearful Mole, looking up in alarm. "We are going to find that home of yours, old fellow," replied the rat pleasantly. "So you'd better come along, for it will take some finding, and we shall want your nose." "Oh, come back, Ratty, do!" cried the Mole, getting up and hurrying after him. "It's no good. It's too late, and it's too dark, and the place is too far off, and the snow is coming. I never meant to let you know I was feeling that way about it. It was all an accident and a mistake. And think of the river bank, and your supper." "Oh, hang the river bank, and supper too," said Ratty. "I tell you, I'm going to find this place now if I stay out all night. So cheer up, old chap, take my arm, and we'll be soon back there again." They moved on in silence for some little way, and then the signals began to come through. The Mole stood rigid for a moment, while his uplifted nose, quivering slightly, felt the air. Then a short, quick run forward, and then a slow, steady, confident advance. Ratty, now much excited, kept close to his heels as the Mole crossed a dry ditch, scrambled through a hedge, and nosed his way over a field in the faint starlight. Suddenly, without giving warning, he dived, and Ratty followed. The earthy smell was strong, and it seemed to take a long time until the passage ended and Ratty could stand up, stretch, and shake himself. The Mole struck a match, and by its light Ratty saw that they were standing in an open space, neatly swept and sanded underfoot, and directly facing them was the mole's little front door. The mole reached down a lantern from a nail and lit it. On the walls hung wire baskets with ferns in them. Down on one side of the forecourt ran a skittle alley with benches along it, and little wooden tables marked with rings that hinted at beer mugs. Mole's face beamed at the sight of all these objects so dear to him, and he hurried Ratty through the door, lit a lamp in the hall, and took one glance around his old home. He saw the dust lying thick on everything. He saw the cheerless, deserted look of the long-neglected house, its worn and shabby contents, and he collapsed on a hall chair, his nose to his paws. "Oh, Ratty, why ever did I do it? Why did I bring you to this poor, cold little place on a night like this? You might have been at the river-bank by this time, toasting your toes before a blazing fire, with all your own nice things about you." Ratty paid no heed to his doleful self-reproaches. Instead, he ran here and there, opening doors, inspecting rooms and cupboards, and lighting lamps and candles and sticking them up everywhere. What a capital little house this is! So compact, so well planned, everything here and everything in its place. Listen, we'll make a jolly night of it. The first thing we want is a good fire. I'll see to that. I always know where to find things. So, this is the parlor? Splendid! Your own idea? Those sleeping bunks in the wall? Capital! Now, I'll fetch the wood and the coals, and you get a duster, Moley. You'll find one in the drawer in the kitchen table. And try to smarten things up a bit. Bustle about, old chap. Encouraged by his inspiring companion, the mole roused himself and dusted and polished with energy and heartiness, while Ratty, running to and fro with armfuls of fuel, soon had a cheerful blaze roaring up the chimney. He hailed the mole to come down and warm himself by the fire. But the mole promptly had another fit of the blues, dropping down on a couch in dark despair and burying his face in his duster. "Ratty, how about your supper? You poor, cold, hungry, weary animal. I've got nothing to give you. Nothing. Not a crumb." "Oh, what a fellow you are for giving in," said Ratty reproachfully. "Why, only just now I saw a sardine opener on the kitchen dresser quite distinctly, and everybody knows that that means there are sardines about somewhere in the neighborhood. Pull yourself together and come with me and forage." They went and foraged accordingly, hunting through every cupboard and turning out every drawer. Between them they found a tin of sardines, a box of Captain's biscuits nearly full, and a German sausage encased in silver paper. "There's a banquet for you," observed the rat as he arranged the table. "I know some animals who would give their ears to be sitting down to a supper like this. And that reminds me, what's that little door at the end of the passage? Your cellar, of course. Every luxury in this house. Just you wait a minute." He made for the cellar door and presently reappeared, somewhat dusty, with a bottle of beer in each paw and another under each arm. "Self-indulgent beggar you seem to be, Mole. Deny yourself nothing. This is really the jolliest little place I've ever been. Now, wherever did you pick up those prints? Make the place look so homelike, they do. No wonder you're so fond of it, Moley. Tell us all about it, and how you came to make it what it is." Then, while the rat busied himself fetching plates and knives and forks, and mustard, which he mixed in an egg cup, the mole, his bosom still heaving with the stress of his recent emotion, related how this was planned, and how that was a wonderful find and a bargain, and how this other thing was bought out of laborious savings and a certain amount of going without. Ratty, who was desperately hungry but strove to conceal it, nodded seriously, examining with a puckered brow and saying, "Wonderful," and "Most remarkable," at intervals, when the chance for an observation was given. At last Ratty succeeded in decoying him to the table, and had just got seriously to work with the sardine opener, when sounds were heard from the forecourt without. Sounds like the scuffling of small feet in the gravel, and a confused murmur of tiny voices, while broken sentences reached them. "Whatever's up?" inquired the rat. "I think it must be the field mice," replied the mole. "They go round carol singing regularly at this time of year. Well, they're quite an institution in these parts, and they never pass me over. They come to Mole End last of all. I used to give them hot drinks, and supper too sometimes, when I could afford it. It will be like old times to hear them again." "Let's have a look at them," cried Ratty, jumping up and running to the door. It was a pretty sight, and a seasonable one, that met their eyes when they flung the door open. In the forecourt, lit by the dim rays of a horn lantern, some 8 or 10 little field mice stood in a semicircle, red comforters round their throats, with their forepaws thrust deep into their pockets. With bright, beady eyes they glanced shyly at each other. "Now then, 1, 2, 3. When the voices ceased, the singers, bashful but smiling, exchanged sidelong glances, and silence succeeded. Then, from up above and far away, was borne to their ears in a faint, musical hum, the sound of distant bells, ringing a joyous and clangorous peal. "Very well sung, boys," said Ratty. "Now come along in, all of you. Warm yourselves by the fire and have something hot." "Yes, come along, field mice," said the mole. "This is quite like old times. Now please shut the door after you, and pull up that settle to the fire. Now, just wait a minute while we—" "Oh, Ratty," he cried in despair, plumping down on a seat. "Whatever are we doing? We've got nothing to give them." "You leave that all to me," said Ratty. "Here, you with the lantern, come over this way. I want to talk to you. Now tell me, are there any shops open at this hour of night?" "Why, certainly, sir," replied a field mouse respectfully. "At this time of year, our shops keep open to all sorts of hours." "Then look here," said Ratty. "You go off at once, you and your lantern, and you get me." Here much muffled conversation ensued, and the mole heard only bits of it. Finally there was a chink of coin passing from paw to paw, and the field mouse was provided with an ample basket for his purchases, and off he hurried, he and his lantern. The rest of the field mice perched in a row on the settle, their small legs swinging, and gave themselves up to the enjoyment of the fire, and toasted themselves until they tingled. Ratty, meanwhile, was busy examining the label on one of the beer bottles. "I perceive this to be old Burton," he remarked approvingly. "Sensible mole, the very thing. Now we shall be able to mull some ale. Get the things ready, Moley, while I draw the corks." It didn't take long to prepare the brew and thrust the tin heater well into the red heart of the fire. And soon every field mouse was sipping and coughing and choking, for a little mulled ale goes a long way. At that moment, the latch clicked, the door opened, and the field mouse with the lantern reappeared, staggering under the weight of his basket. Once the real and solid contents of the basket had been tumbled out on the table, under the generalship of Ratty, everybody was set to do something or fetch something. In a very few minutes, supper was ready, and the mole, as he took the head of the table in a sort of dream, saw a lately barren board now set thick with savory comforts. The mole was at first silent and overcome with humbled emotion. He knew at once that the generosity and tenderness rained upon his home and hearth was provided by none other than his woodland companion. Barely able to speak, he gathered himself to declare, oh my, what a feast this is! And, well, I thank you, my dear Ratty, from the bottom of my heart, a heart that has been blessed and touched with such kindness and benevolence. Thank you all." He saw his little friends' faces brighten and beam as they fell to without delay. And then he let himself loose, for he was famished indeed, and thinking what a happy homecoming this had turned out to be after all. Ratty said little or nothing, only taking care that each guest had what he wanted, and plenty of it, and that Mole had no trouble or anxiety about anything. They all clattered off at last, very grateful and showering wishes of the season. When the door had closed and the chink of the lanterns had died away, Mole and Ratty kicked the fire up, drew their chairs in, brewed themselves a last nightcap of mulled ale, and discussed the events of a long day. At last Ratty, with a tremendous yawn, said, "Mole, old chap, I'm ready to drop. Sleepy is simply not the word." With that, he clambered into his bunk and rolled himself well up in the blankets. The weary Mole was also glad to turn in without delay, and soon had his head on his pillow in great joy and contentment. But before he closed his eyes, he let them wander around his old room, mellow in the glow of the firelight that played or rested on familiar and friendly things which had long been unconsciously a part of him. Meanwhile, Ratty gently stirred, half awake. He listened to the distant bells ringing out across the frost-covered countryside. As they drifted into dreams, a woodland carol rang out in the winter twilight, blessing that spoke of the joy of living and the delight of giving of the season. Creatures all are safe and warm, hidden from the weather. Winter winds may rage and howl, we will be together. When the icy winter comes, love of all we raise. Warm hearts by the fireside, this our song of praise. For the beauty of each hour of the day and night, hill and vale and tree and flower, sun and moon